And she said, well, I'm circling back here now later in my life because I was removed and adopted here as a child. And I said, oh, adoption, that's a nice life-saving thing. And that was not her experience. Most experiences were not very positive. And she told me about that. And then she mentioned the boarding schools, and the first federally funded boarding school, which basically these were assimilation schools, where the outward slogan of our government for these schools was kill the Indian and save the man, save the child.
This is People I Know Show, a podcast about influential people, personal growth, and being wrong. I'm Kurt Karstensen. This is episode 58. My guest is Drew Nicholas. Drew is a filmmaker. His documentary is Blood Memory, which explores the rarely told story of the adoption era of American Indians, where nearly 1/3 of children were removed from their tribal communities nationwide, and the impact this continues to have to the present day. This was Drew's first big film project. I was stunned to find out how long he has been working on it and fascinated by the process. Links to ways to connect with Drew or I are in the show notes, and please share this episode if it connects with you. Now, my conversation with Drew Nicholas. Drew Nicholas joins me today from Eastern Pennsylvania, I'm told. Welcome, Drew.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining. You're in Pennsylvania now, somewhere near Philadelphia?
Yeah, about 45 minutes north of Philly, along the Delaware River between Pennsylvania and New Jersey.
And that is where you grew up?
Yeah, Bucks County.
I met you in, I believe it was early March of this year. You were in the suburban Twin Cities area in Minnesota. I don't know, I can never keep track specifically because it doesn't really matter to me. I was either your Uber driver or your Lyft driver, which has happened before with previous guests on this podcast. We had a brief conversation. You were on your way to getting a haircut, I think. Have you gotten a second haircut since March?
I may have gotten one since then. But yeah.
I'm surprised you've only had one. I kind of want to see what you look like. We're doing this audio only right now. So we barely know each other, but you're someone. There's a reason we barely know each other?
No. I meant for the haircut, the video. Yeah, never mind.
Okay, no, it's all good. I like one of the things I identified in my last episode was there needs to be more fun, more laughter every episode. So we can make fun of each other now, and then we'll get into the serious stuff shortly. You were telling me that day about this video project you had just finished, and I learned a little bit about it. And now, as of very recently, here on Thanksgiving weekend, as we're recording this, I was able to see your film. The film is titled Blood Memory, A Story of Removal and Return. You're listed as the director and the producer. This was a high-quality documentary from my perspective, but reading about it and remembering what we talked about, this was something that you really hadn't done before. So tell me and the audience how in the world you get into this big project, and tell me in your best description what it is.
Yeah. So, I'll start off with giving a little sense of what it's about, and then we'll just kind of tell the story from there, I guess, of how it came together. But basically, it's about as it says, a story of removal and return. It's about a history of indigenous children being removed from their families and their communities. Which has roots all the way back to the beginning of, colonizing America, but really became a government practice in the late 1800s through boarding schools, and then slowly worked its way into becoming a practice in adoption. And so that's our primary focus, is this, what we're terming, not us, but the people who are in the film have started to term the adoption era, which runs from the 1940s through the 1970s and led to the call for the government to pass what's now called the Indian Child Welfare Act, which was passed in 1978. A lot of people call it ICWA. Basically, that was passed in 1978 because in the 1960s, they had done a study and found that a third of indigenous children had been removed from their communities nationwide. So basically, they put the pressure on Congress to create a federal law to protect Native kids. So our film tells that history, but then follows a woman who was removed as a result of an adoption, and a lawyer who is working in Indian child welfare. And it's basically, we're wondering in the film, is he trying to take this law down? Is he trying to protect this law? And sort of the two sides of the, so to say, it's not just two sides, but some different perspectives on the ongoing impact of childhood removal.
Yeah, that's one of the things I found was very important about the film. It's kind of, for me, kind of difficult to understand where he was going at times, but it did allow for additional perspectives, because you're not just showing this is how these people were wronged in all these ways. There's a fair amount of that, because it seems to be the legitimate good reason to have this film, but there's also people that might think differently. And the lawyer featured, he's, I believe, 1/4 Native American Indian, however he describes himself. So it kind of gets someone like me thinking, okay, this person's involved in all these different ways, and he has this perspective, this woman, different perspective. And I really think it draws the story together, that this is complex and people are dealing with this from all different sides.
Yeah, I had this. The story and the history is already complex, and then naturally we added a layer of complexity to it. But yeah, it kind of evolved that way. You know, it was like, okay, the story was initially about Sandy Whitehawk, who's lives in the Twin Cities area, and she is Chichangu Lakota from Rosebud, South Dakota, and so she's done a lot of healing work. As she reunited with her family and sort of started this whole movement, unintentionally or not, to help others find their way home. And through that has created a song and ceremony to acknowledge those who've been removed through foster care and adoption and boarding schools, and birth parents who've lost their children in the community, because there's a lot of silence in the community around it. And then, you know, contrasting her, we have the lawyer, but it's, you know, his name is Mark Fiddler. He's a member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians up in North Dakota. But he was raised in the Twin Cities as well. And as we started to work with both of them and understand their stories and their backgrounds and their motivations, there were a lot of crossovers, and a lot of it had to do with the impact that those policies of removal have played in their families and how they're both dealing with it differently. I don't want to give too much away about that, because I think I want to leave sort of some of that fresh reveal to be left in the film. But really, you know, that becomes sort of the antagonist. It's not about either one of them being the antagonist or the protagonist, but it's about the sort of communal conflict with that sort of overriding colonization and erasure, you know.
Drew, I'm choosing to have this conversation with you around the Thanksgiving holiday because I think it kind of sets me back on my life journey of understanding and misunderstanding and learning and unlearning, with me being a white kid from rural Minnesota. I observed some views of the Native American Indian people in one way, not really knowing or understanding. I grew up, there'd be the cowboy and Indian movies on, and oftentimes in those films and whatever else, the Indians were the bad guys, and just a lot of this cultural stuff brought up to the average white person to probably leave us thinking more negatively about this group of people. Well, life transpires. I learned more about all kinds of different things. And more recently, back probably a few months after I met you, I had an episode, it ended up being episode 36, with a former coworker of mine, Terry Henry, who was brought up during this era where we talked about boarding school, where she or her family members had to do some of that, and the film gets into that, as well as kind of the forced adoption which would happen. And this is something that she lived through, her family lived through, and we talked about that in that conversation. She inspired me to think differently about this more than anybody has before. But really watching your film, Blood Memory, and learning about it from a visual perspective and the individuals involved for hour and a half, 2 hour film. It's like, wow, there's so much I don't understand. And all of the people, seeing the visuals of all the people that this happened to, and there's so many more. It's really something that I think most white people from a rural part of the country, for instance, don't grasp. And here you are, as best I understand it, you're not that different from me in that way. Describe your background and why this is something you even got involved with.
Yeah, sure. So for quick context, it affects every family. I mean, family separation, it affects not just the immediate family, but, your aunts, your uncles, your grandparents. And then pretty soon you scope that out, and it's everyone in the community that's affected by the child, because that child is a member of the communal family. So, I think that's a societal difference that we need to look at first and foremost, of how, we in white society separate out our individual families as our nuclear family, whereas in the tribal community, everyone is family. So it is, accurate to say everybody in the community is affected when a family loses a child. But to sort of step to my perspective, yeah, I mean, as you said, a white boy from the countryside, and Pennsylvania, we've had no federally recognized tribes in PA since the 1960s, when Seneca Nation was pushed all up into New York State by flooding of their lands. So that was the last time we had a recognized tribe here. And the Lenape people are working on getting recognized. Yeah, I had a very similar background. And basically the way I got exposed to this story, I just gotten out of film school. I was sitting in a coffee shop in Pittsburgh with a bunch of my fellow film school grads, because I went to school out there at Point Park University. And we were just talking about where everyone was going to go now that we were graduating. What are we all going to do? What do we want to do? And this woman who was there overheard our conversation. She had an interest in film and just said, "Hey, I have a story for you." And I was like, "Oh, sure." Most of the time people don't listen to that, but I was just like, it was just like the right setting. It was presented the right way. I was like, "Sure. What do you got?" And she started talking about a TV show that I couldn't really help her with. But then as we were talking, I just kind of asked her, what brought her, this native woman from Minnesota, to Pittsburgh? Because I'd never met anybody who told me they were indigenous, in Pennsylvania. And she said, "Well, I'm circling back here now later in my life because I was removed and adopted here as a child." I said, "Oh, adoption, that's a nice life-saving thing." And that was not her experience. As you had just mentioned, most experiences were not very positive. And she told me about that. And then she mentioned the boarding schools, and the first federally funded boarding school, which basically these were assimilation schools, where the outward slogan of our government for these schools was "Kill the Indian and save the man, save the child." So the idea was, make them look white, act white, speak white, be white, and eliminate any, savageness, so to say. And the first one was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And I had never heard of that history. And I'd grown up camping in Carlisle, going there to car shows with my brothers and my dad. And it just sort of all hit home really quickly in that conversation that I'm 21 years old. I just graduated film school. I'm talking about how I want to, go do something with that degree in the world. And then this thing kind of falls in my lap and it's like, you don't know anything about the world you're stepping into. And she had mentioned Sandy's name, Sandy Whitehawk. And I looked Sandy up online, called her, and I was just like, why don't I know about this? And she's like, it's intentional that you don't know about it. And she was having a powwow that weekend at the Minneapolis American Indian Center. And she said, why don't you come out to Minneapolis and see what it's about? And so I did. And I was just very moved by what I saw, what I heard. what those in the community had shared with me. And from there, it just sort of started to snowball.
How old were you then, and how old are you now? How long has this taken?
Yeah, so I was 21 then, maybe 20, 21 probably, and I'm 31 now. So it was a 9-year project, and
Holy
this is
crap.
going into its 10th year. Yeah,
That's impressive. So there's a whole nother aspect of the fact that the project takes so long that I do want to get into, because I'm fascinated by the fact that you've been doing this for 9 years and now you're just kind of getting started to make sure people see it. So from there, as the 21-year-old and building this project and getting people interested in it. So I guess this kind of ties into that side of it as well. How did you have any authority or pull or to get anyone else involved who, as you were at that time, to even get funding or the time and the effort? It all seems so wild to me.
Thinking back on it, it is, it was being naive that was sort of the blessing, because now I know what it took and the resources that it requires. And if I had gotten sort of bogged down with all of that in the beginning and not just thought like, oh, all I need are some friends and a couple cameras and we can do this, And I really didn't understand the scope either. I had no idea, but then as I got a better sense of it and as I had more invested in it, obviously my stake in the investment went up. So I wanted to, make sure it got the best we could get for, the project. But really it was all very self-funded until it was completely shot. And then we got some funding from a group called Filmmaker Media. And they get Corporation for Public Broadcast funds to bring Native stories to public broadcast. So they, for lack of a better term, acquired the film once it was in the tank, so to say, and helped us edit it and get it ready. So we will have a public broadcast of the film in 2020 with our relationship through them. But basically, it was all self-funded for 7 of the 9 years. And we just did it in pieces. Early on, it took really 5 years for the story to develop and to get it right, to do the research, to do the community building. And that was sort of the biggest lesson as a filmmaker that I started with was, okay, as you said, what's the authority of a 21-year-old stepping into, Indian country? And people do that all the time, and they fly by night and they come in and they want to make a story and put it out there and move on. And very quickly, A, that wasn't the goal, but then B, when you're talking about something so sensitive and so personal, it requires a lot of trust, and you can't just be flagrant about these relationships and the content that you're putting out there. And so it became very important to be extremely intentional and patient with our decision making and share it with the community throughout the time. And so we did a lot of developmental screenings. So over that first 5 years, it was just reading everything I could to understand the history, meeting as many people as I could, sitting down, having conversations, understanding the scope. And then finally in 2015, Sandy's community in Rosebud, South Dakota, decided to have a welcome home ceremony that she's been pushing for. And so she got to bring this ceremony and this honoring of those who've been removed back to her home community. And we were finally like, okay, this is the story. And the bigger political things were also happening around us, and we were keeping tabs on that. But we knew that this was the heartstring, and yeah, I think that's, when it comes to the authority, it was just about, just keep going, go piece by piece. I do location scouting as a way to make my living. So I, find locations for industry film production, commercial film production. And so I would basically pivot back and forth between working on something for 3 to 6 months and taking that funding that those funds that I raised and going on the road for a week or two or close to a month, and just filming whatever we could. And it would be basically like, okay, here's the next piece. We know what we need to do now. Here's the scope of how things are growing. And it just became this national story. You know, it was pretty intense.
And so you were taking all of your personal funds, basically all your money, and sticking it back into the film, back and forth for the better part of these past 10 years?
Yeah. Yeah, that's basically how it went. And then you know, and then it became a question of like, okay, is it better to rent this equipment or buy some equipment for cheap that we can, you know, that we can have at our disposal anytime we want? We don't have to ship it to ourselves. So a lot of that logistics stuff. So we started to build up like a little bit of a base package and then rent the essential, the bigger ticket items. But it was kind of funny throughout the process. People would comment on like, oh man, you started with like that little DSLR and now you're like, look at you have like a real movie camera, you know, you know. But yeah, so it was a growth, you know.
Yeah, that part of it totally fascinating to me. I want to get back to the purpose of the film, and I think it seems like we're going to kind of bounce back and forth between that aspect of creating over that length of time and the reason that it's even relevant that anyone watches this. And I think what I gathered from watching the film, you mentioned the ceremony that apparently happened in 2015 where a large number of the adoptees, now adults, came back for a big gathering. Just to see that many people in that part of the film together and some of them sharing their stories, that's a very emotional part of the film. But I think what strikes me is someone mentioned earlier in the film that adoption is a commodity that was used. And that struck me as well, because me not being adopted, knowing a few people that were adopted, I never looked at it that way. And I'm sure in some cases it's not, but throughout the world, and perhaps especially in this story, that was such a part of it, that there's someone making money somewhere because they were willing to adopt these children from these families, these native families that weren't wanting to give up their kids to adoption. The whole thing is just crazy that this was happening in this country. And the other layer of it is there's stats supporting the fact that the foster care that's happening in this country still, by far and away, there's more individuals that come from a native community or a reservation that are a part of this program. So this hasn't really changed in any way that we can say that things have gotten way better.
Yeah, it's sort of a dual-edged sword with the statistics. And I'm not, you know, an expert in that field by any means. But the statistics that we kind of end the historical sequence with right before we bring it to modern day. So the beginning of the film, for those who haven't seen it, starts with, you know, basically through a flashback, tells you the history and sort of timelines everything for you. So you can go into Sandy and Mark's modern day experiences with that base knowledge and then live in their lives from that point forward. But we end that historical sequence with some statistics of the foster care system, as you just said. And so nationwide, it's 3 native children for every white child in the foster care system. And then in South Dakota, where we did most of the filming, it's 9-1. And in Minnesota, where both Sandy and Mark are located, and we also did a good portion of filming, it's about 22 to 23 native children for every 1 child in the foster care system. Now that's just foster care.
Foster care, different than adoption at this point in time, but it's the idea that these children, for whatever reasons, then and now, maybe it's slightly different. I don't quite understand that yet myself, but the fact that children born to families end up not with that family at such an extreme rate compared to normal. And I just don't, I suspect that the average person living in this country has no idea about any of this.
And you can argue, you know, there's people that take those statistics and argue them for whatever their purpose may be. There's people argue that, well, ICWA's not working because the statistics are just as bad as they were in the 60s and 70s when the law was passed. Then there's also modern circumstances. There's also the fact that this law hasn't been acknowledged significantly, and judges and lawyers still don't know even how to implement it to this day, 40 plus years later. So people use those statistics for their own purpose. Either way, it's still an issue. It's not something that's in the past. It's not something that's 100 years ago. It's still happening today. And there are a lot of people in the film that speak to that, and how it, and whether children, are being removed directly, the familial impact and the intergenerational impact that's still happening, is creating trauma, and that trauma is being put on children, whether it's through through reasons they would end up in the system or not. So it is that's why healing it and talking about it and bringing it to the surface is so important for Sandy and those who've lived it, because they're trying to to fix the problem instead of just kicking it down the road, so to say.
I think the film is incredible. I have a much better understanding. I still, like most things, I learn more about something. I feel like I still don't know anything because I'm just scratching the surface, but I've learned a lot more based on watching Blood Memory than I ever understood before. And really the visual and seeing and hearing people, and a lot of different people that lived through this, really connects. And that's why I think watching this film is a powerful thing for anybody. I'm curious, as I think we kind of break away from the film itself to the process, and then I want to learn more about you. I'm curious, have other films related to this been done in any way, or is this the first of its kind?
No, there's actually, there's a lot of films out about this. There's films with the title Blood Memory, actually, and we even, heavily considered that title when we did. Ultimately, it just really fit for the story. But there's a documentary out of Canada that a bunch of students got together and told their story of blood memory. And blood memory is that concept of that intergenerational connection. It's about survival. It's just as much of like, that nature versus nurture piece of like, how do you know how to, open your eyes and, breastfeed as a child? How do you know what to do? Those are ingrained things that we just sort of take for granted. But then there's also the ingrained things in our blood, that are passed from our ancestors, and that's both positive and negative. So that's sort of what the film, for us, really became about, as we were learning what it was saying to us, and what everybody was saying to us. And then there are definitely films that directly cover the boarding schools. There's a whole bunch of them. If you just go on YouTube and search, there's, or you go on Google, there's a plethora of stuff from community level, all the way up to, nationally funded stuff. HuffPost, Vice have done a bunch of work on it. There's a really good film that just won an Emmy Award last year called Dawnland, which they focus on a healing piece of this, basically from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Maine, that the Maine Wabanaki people put together, and it documents that process of how the community, the indigenous community and the non-native community came together to sort of confront this past. It was done in Canada on a nationwide scale, and a lot of has resulted from that, both false promises and fulfilled promises. But I think that's sort of I really, think that the two films can really go well together when you can look at the impact. So there's definitely a lot of content out there once you start looking. There are a lot of great books on the subject as well. If you go to our website, we have a resources page, which we've been keeping sort of a working bibliography, if you are interested in reading. And it's from all aspects. It's in fiction, nonfiction.
The website and Facebook or whatever, it's mentioned those now. I'll put them in the show notes as well, because at the time of the release of this conversation for the podcast, I don't know that the film Blood Memory is going to be that accessible immediately for many people, but I'd imagine you're going to have a few more screenings perhaps, and you can share that. And then when the release, so if someone follows on Facebook, for instance, or whatever, that when the release on public television comes out, they'll be alerted. I'll probably do some more with this episode as that date comes along. But for people really interested in it, what's the website and what do you suggest they do?
Sure. So if you just go on any social media platform or on the web, if you just type in Blood Memory Doc, that Blood Memory DOC, and then .com, or just at Blood Memory Doc, you'll find us. As for accessibility, people can. We do institutions and individuals, teachers, things like that. We do have educational distribution available now through our distributor Tugg edu. So basically, Tugg is a online platform for educational distribution. They have a really great platform for teachers to put notes right in the film timeline and watch it online. They can download it and keep it in a digital library, or they can buy a copy, DVD or Blu-ray, for library or whatever purposes they need. So you can go on there, use their website to acquire the film in its current form, and then we are currently in the process of editing it down to an hour broadcast window, which will be. It's looking like we're going to be on America Reframed on the World Channel. And that will be sometime in 2020, probably May or later is what we're thinking right now. So it will. We'll push heavily to have it available in the Twin Cities and South Dakota public broadcast markets. So keep an eye on that, and obviously we'll be sharing that information on all of our social media as well.
And I noticed on the social media this morning, as I was glancing through it, that you had maybe one of your first big announcements of recognition.
Yeah. We finally won an award, which was pretty exciting. Kansas City International Film Festival, we got Audience Choice Best Documentary Feature, which was a fantastic festival. I highly recommend it. Recommend it to filmmakers. They're just such a great group down there. Really well attended screenings. So it was really great for that to be one of our first acknowledgments, and and we just wrapped up our festival tour of 2019. We just had our last screening of the year, but we do have some more festival screenings coming up in 2020. We will be in the Minnesota again for Frozen River Film Festival down in Winona, so not too far from the Twin Cities. And then there are always community screenings happening too. So the best way to keep track of our screenings is to go to our Facebook page and go to the events tab. Pretty much we try to have an event of some sort posted for every single screening. So that's the easiest way to do it.
That's great. I look forward to seeing it in a theater at some point in the future to kind of get the reaction of everyone around me as well. And I'd imagine for you, I've learned this a little bit putting this podcast and many episodes now out. What's it for you being at a screening? Like, obviously you've put years into this and money and pretty much your whole life, it seems like, into this at times. What's it like seeing other people's reactions to it? How impactful is that for you as a person producing and directing a film?
Yeah, it's kind of crazy because you think eventually you get sick and tired of seeing your movie, and it's true. Sometimes you do. Sometimes it's like, I'm going to sit this one out. I've had a long day. But just recently, the film, we played it in Richmond, Virginia, at a really great film festival called Pocahontas Reframed. And they played it at 9 a.m. on a Sunday. And I was like, no one's going to be there at 9 a.m. on a Sunday. And that was one of the biggest audiences we've had recently. And great dialogue after the conversation after the film, and people were engaged. That film festival runs from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. for 4 days, and it was, very well attended. So it's always different, but it is really interesting how the environment of the room changes your experience. There is sort of an energy that persists throughout the theater, which is why I love going to the movies. The Irishman is out and everyone's like, oh, should I see it on Netflix or should I go, watch it in the theater? Go watch it in the theater because people laugh around you. You share in the experience, and that's what's great. I love, there's all these different markers that, are established in the film by the audience of, okay, a lot of people laugh at this point, which is, it's really critical in a film with such a heavy subject to have humor, to have uplifting moments, to, bring you, just to keep it human. And so it's just interesting to see, okay, the audience is engaged, the audience is on pace with, our general audience, or, oh, okay, they reacted to something differently. And sometimes I don't cry at all anymore. And then sometimes I cry at the most mundane thing, because so many of the people in the film I've had an ongoing personal relationship with. And it's, when you're talking about 9 years later, from the time I may have met them, I get very emotional about when I notice something in the story. I'm like, wow, that person has achieved that thing. Or, wow, look at that little moment where they're choked up about that. And then I think about the thing that, how they may be with their children today, and just sort of that healing that's happening. So there's definitely a lot of emotion and personal investment for me, which I honestly would not want any other way, and I think it's going to be hard to find another project that would fulfill that.
What you just stated brings me to the next two questions. So you mentioned kind of the general audience and the different reactions that you get and what you experience based on what's around you. But then you mentioned the people you've had the personal relationships with. Have you seen a screening with some of them and seen and felt their reaction, knowing that you've known them and they're seeing this on screen? Maybe it's them speaking or possibly in tears on screen and they're next to you. That's got to be a whole nother level of experience in the film.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of our screenings were based off of where the people who are in the film are located. So the experts who interviewed for the film, or those with lived experience who have their lived experience experts. We were like, okay, we gotta go here, here, and here, and here, and show it for this person. And anytime we bring it to someone's community, we usually have them up there with us in the Q&A to present the film in any way that we can, so that they can share their personal experience with their immediate community, which I think is really critical to awareness, and to just creating. It's hard for people to have that sort of immediate impact. So if you can do anything locally to keep it local, to keep that impact immediate. The film played in Flagstaff, Arizona, and unfortunately, no one else with the film could be there other than myself, and some people who are big supporters of the film came. And then we also brought some folks who work in Indian child welfare from Navajo Nation, and they shared their stories of what's happening in the community right outside the theater, and that was unbelievable. That was almost more emotionally impactful than the film. And so I think having those local impacts that's the goal that we set out very intentionally, to be able to do that, to elevate local stories, local people who are sacrificing a lot more than we did, just to do good work in their community and to keep children in the community.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I've never thought about films in that way, just hearing the process of releasing it in city by city and showcasing it and having those conversations right there. That's not the way that I normally watch a movie. And this is a movie, but it's a documentary, and there's a real lesson and stories and really personal things happening there that I think allows for those conversations in ways maybe the average film doesn't. They're just there for entertainment. This is for entertainment partially, but really for education, and to help more people become compassionate towards a cause and do whatever we all can to make life better for those that have been and continue to be affected by what the film showcases.
Yeah, and that's a big thing that we asked ourselves a lot about, and I think, and people still ask us after the film, because I think a lot of I don't know if it's necessarily a human rights, like you think of a human rights genre of documentary, you think of Darfur, you think of, slavery and things like that. But this is a human rights story. And with that genre of documentary, people so often want a call to action at the end. Go to our website, donate to this, click on this, and you're absolved of your guilt, and you can move on, and you've fixed the problem. And it's not that easy, and there is no easy out. and there is no quick remedy. And we don't have that in our film. And so some people, they watch it, they feel lost about how they can have an impact or what they can do. And they come up and they ask what we can do, or in the Q&A they do. And for us, it's really about just, okay, elevate this locally, and have the conversation, especially in the non-native community. Yeah, we don't know this history. So let's educate ourselves on it. Come watch the film, come have a dialogue with your community. A lot of church groups have been doing that with our film. A lot of social work groups, we're doing trainings for the Minnesota DHS and foster care recruitment, all kinds of stuff, where the film is being used as a tool to bring people together over a common conversation. And, I know one thing that I've heard a lot of is, Indian country is sick and tired of giving, what's it mean to be Native American 101 to every non-Native person. And I think that's something that we need to take responsibility upon ourselves to go like, okay, let's educate ourselves. Let's not put the burden on the Indigenous community, because there's already enough burden that's been placed there,
Yeah. Let's slide away from that for a moment. I think it's powerful, and hopefully people will go onto the website and find what they can at the time being, and everyone can see this film when the opportunity first arises. I'm curious now about you, learning more about you, Drew, as you're 9 years into this, and the final big push to get it seen by as many people has been happening and will continue to happen. If you knew it was going to take 9 years to get to this point, I know you mentioned you're kind of naive at that point, just graduating college. Would have you taken it on if someone said, yeah, we're doing this, it's going to take 9 years and basically all your money or whatever it was? Is that something you would have done at that time? And as you look to your next project, how do you move forward?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's funny because I'd like to say, yeah, of course. And I do ultimately think that is still the answer, because this has been, for lack of a better word, it's been an obsession for 9 years. It's been the thing that's kept me motivated in all aspects of my life. Sort of all roads lead to this project, for better or worse. I've lost a lot of things, lost a lot of friends, for various reasons because of because of my obsession and my commitment to the project. And I definitely question a lot of the choices I made, but I won't do it the same way, to do it again. But that doesn't mean I wouldn't do it, because the lessons I learned in the 9 years, the way I kind of justified the investment I was making was that I didn't go to grad school. And I was like, this is my living grad school. It's not going to take 2 years. I didn't know how long it was going to take. At first, I thought maybe 3 years max. And then it just got huge and took time. And I did step away from it for a while too, to gain some perspective. But I was like, you know what? I'm just going to invest the money that I would have put toward grad school into this. Or, okay, what else would I have with this money? A house. Okay, cool. I have a house now. This was the most personally satisfying, to be able to work on my craft, to learn how to make a film properly, to learn how the industry around that works, to learn this history, to connect with people I have no other means of, really intimately connecting with. And then to be able to take it around the world. I mean, it's that's why I got into film, because it's an amalgamation of everything I love, photography, travel, music, just visualizing, storytelling.
Well, then I think that leads into my second question there, and I can tie this all together with my most recent episode of the podcast, where I was trying to better understand my vision and really hoping that the audience could look back onto their own vision and what they're trying to do with whatever they're doing in their life. So tying it back into this particular project or your future, what you've learned from all this, what would you say is your vision right now for whatever you're doing or for your life, however you want to take it? What is the vision for Drew Nicholas?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely the question I'm asking myself, as I'm asking what's the next project. I was very adamant that I wasn't going to ask that question until this was done. And this still isn't totally done.
Bad.
Sorry, go again. I missed
No,
that.
I just then I'm interjecting right now that I messed up your vision for not having a vision finalized yet.
Well, no. I mean, it's that time now where it's like, okay, well, your baby is growing up and stepping out into the world, and like, yeah, you still have a little bit to do to like make sure that this film can have its own legs and do its own thing, and to sort of let it go. And I'm at that point where like, okay, I can see the other side. And it's been a year since it's been released. It was released in February of 2019. So, it's finally getting out there, but the broadcast is sort of the last leg, and then hopefully the educational tools with it. But I've been developing some ideas in the back of my head, and I just felt like, the next thing will come as this came by happenstance, by divine intervention, whatever you want to call it. It'll just happen. And I'll just pay attention a little bit more this time. And when that person says, hey, I have a story for you, I'm going to listen, and there's been a couple times people have brought that to my attention, have said that. And, pitch their ideas. I think the big thing is getting support up front is huge. It's critical, to get everything moving. But then at the same time, not being able to move too quickly early on in this project and being hamstringed by the resources that were or weren't available, established a pace that was critical for the project. So it was built in. So I'm really not trying to dictate the parameters. I'm just sort of taking my experience and letting it evolve.
Let's transition then to the personal growth segment. I think it probably all ties together in some ways. You have been learning a lot in the last decade doing this, but when I talk about personal growth, what have you identified from your life, from your development, that you think is maybe most powerful to share right now, the fact that you've been learning and growing in whatever ways over the recent years?
Yeah. Well, I think back when I first got introduced to this project, I was traveling a lot. I was taking road trips in my car and just trying to see the country as well. And then one time I was just, I was down in Austin, Texas, and it was my 25th birthday. So it was like sort of halfway through the production. And I was just like, you know what? I'm spending so much darn money, flying around the country for no other purpose other than just, expanding my horizons. And, in a way it's aimless, but in other ways it's very enlightening. And I was just struggling with that. And I made a commitment to myself that, any investment I'm going to make with my money is going to be toward something. It's going to be an investment. It's not going to just be throwing it into the wind. And that's a lot easier said than done. But that's when I really sort of recommitted to the project and, put everything into it and stopped waiting for something to come to it to help. And so I think that's sort of a huge life lesson and a huge maturity that happened. And then I also just I look back on, on that whole period, I'm 30 now, and it's like processing okay, I'm here. What's the next step? Knowing that it could very well take till I'm 40 to finish the next project, because this one proved that that's possible. So it's like, what do you want to commit the next potential decade of your life to talking about and investing in? And then I think just from the process of making the film, learning about community development and how critical that is, and having dialogue from the beginning where everyone's involved. You go through film school and you graduate with this very, they want to teach you how to control the narrative, how to control the story, how to use intentional techniques to achieve said emotional result. And that works, and you can apply it to documentary, but you have to be much more willing to sort of work with your environment and figure out how you can use that training you have in a free form. And so, but it broke that sort of formulaic response, having to go into the community and, be patient and talk things out before we would just roll the camera. And that's now part of the way that I want to do it and the way that I see the world. So creatively, that's a part of the creative process now.
That's big. I think just how you're spending your money, I think depending on someone's upbringing and how their family or whoever was around them to encourage them with money, that's something we all handle differently. But knowing that you at a certain point realize if you're spending money, it's got to be for making my life improve in certain ways. That's like a powerful understanding, and not just throwing it and having fun for no reason other than to have fun. Maybe have fun in a way that's also going to help your progress in a way. That's what I took from what you said.
Yeah, and it's a much more enjoyable result, But I'm not perfect in that, I'm, trust me, but you get better at it.
Just you think about it more when you're doing something. Is this really worth my time and money and effort? And at a certain point, if you have that vision and you're closer to it, or you're making progress to understand what you want from your life, like you talked about this film and so much over the past decade, that everything you were doing was leading in a certain direction. And I think that's something I found for myself as I've grown. It's important that, not everything's going to be in a perfectly straight line to where I think I want to go, but it's going to be trending in that right way so that I can get there eventually, but hopefully sooner, because I'm not wasting time going in all sorts of directions.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've seen a lot of, like, one thing that I did that I've seen a lot of sort of my fellow film school grads do is, or not do, is, the location scouting gig. Like I interned as a location intern, in the department back in film school. And that eventually led to me getting hired as a production assistant. And I worked my way up. But had I sort of been indecisive and tried to search for something better, because I was cleaning toilets, I was taking out trash, for years, for 4 or 5 years on film sets. I'm the last person on the film set that someone would have anticipated is making a movie, but it was because I was like, what, I'm committing myself to this thing because I see a way to make a living in this and to make the money that I need to pursue the thing I actually want to pursue, and to be able to pivot back and forth and use this as a tool for that. So because I committed to that thing and I didn't waver from it, I was able to maximize resources very quickly and efficiently, and then have the control that I wanted to have to be able to go and pursue my passion. There's a great book about that, which has probably come up in some of your conversations, but Ignore Everyone and 39 Other Steps to Being Creative. And it's a great book about this guy in New York who started doodling on napkins on the back of business cards at a bar after he was done with work, and then eventually built it up to a blog and a book. And it's his own successful business, but he still maintains his day job because he needs it for his creative process, and he needs it to, break up the monotony of any one thing, which is just always, and he talks about that pivoting and that balance,
Yeah, that connects with me because I have a number of things going on in addition to putting this podcast out and trying to learn and grow from it. So I appreciate you saying that, because that really makes sense to me, resonates with me in the fact that if I wasn't an Uber and Lyft driver, I would have never met you. And you're one of many people that I've met through that process, some that I've at least exchanged a card with to make sure that you don't necessarily leave my life forever, but I'm going to keep doing that because the people that I'll meet and continue to meet, to have conversations like this that I can put out that I think are important, because you're doing important work. Other people are doing important work that, yes, it may not be the most have the largest notoriety in the world, but there's a level of notoriety in the project and the creativity that you've had and the thing that you've worked on. It's worth seeing. And it's awesome that I get to meet people that are doing stuff like me in its own way. I'm trying to create something other people are creating, and to bring it all together here, I can't imagine ever not doing that job, because I'll probably run out of guests for the podcast eventually if I don't meet random people doing amazing work somewhere else in the world in some other way and kind of bring it all together. So I think that's a really great point about not focusing all of your time and effort, all your resources onto one thing specifically, because then you're gonna narrow your scope of who you might meet and what you might be doing in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How about we switch now to the being wrong segment? As a way to look back on your life, Drew, of something that you've changed your mind about drastically and something perhaps you could say you were wrong about. What comes to mind when I bring up that topic, being wrong?
Oh man, everything. No, I think first and foremost, just to kind of reiterate that community piece and the film school mentality of coming in and just I was young and willing to work with Sandy because I knew that was critical to the story being told, is working with her. And, but there were definitely times where I thought, like, Sandy, you don't understand the filmmaking world and how we need to contextualize this for the audience. Like, I get your point, but it's going to be hard to contextualize it for the audience. And we need to do this, or the audience needs story. They need this. We can't just give fact, but then she's like, yeah, but this isn't the story. This isn't right, and sometimes it would take me, a lot of reflection or just processing to understand what she was talking about, something not being right or appropriate, or creating the wrong message or going off the narrative. And, you realize, the filmmaking perspective isn't right. You're not I think filmmakers tend to think there's sort of this omniscient force, and that they can be sort of impartial to everything around them. And in a way, you're sort of like playing this God role, because you're telling the story, you're manipulating the audience. Whether it's like over manipulation or a proper manipulation, your music, your editing, your visuals, it's all manipulation. And some people can use that for good, and some people can use that to falsify, the truth. And so we had a lot of dialogue about that. And she, because she's a very high profile person, a lot of journalists will come to her from, the New York Times or the Washington Post or whatever it may be. And they've already got their narrative. They already have the article written. They just need a quote from her. And instead of actually listening to what she's saying, they're just waiting for that one line. And then they get off the phone and they go print the story. And so because she's had those experiences, she had built up a defense to that very well. And, and I think because we didn't have the power of the New York Times where we could just say and do whatever, we factually think is right. We had to, be more impartial and sympathetic and, rapport building, that we did, we had to come back the next day, and sit with ourselves in a much more responsible way, I think. And so, admitting like, okay, my perspective's wrong, and I don't know everything, and I can't judge right and wrong, as the filmmaker, as the storyteller. And it's very inappropriate to paint people into a good and bad, for the sake of the narrative, that we all want to have, that we've all been taught of how it should be structured. So I think that was sort of the biggest lesson learned over time.
That is a powerful lesson and something that resonates with me precisely. Now I'm afraid that I'm in too much control in some of these conversations that I'm having. I try not to be, but I do know some people when they're doing a podcast or any sort of interview that they push it in a direction. I try not to do that, but now I'm kind of hypersensitive thinking, am I doing that sometimes? What can I do better? And as you bring that up, I also saw a film recently, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, I think is what it's called. It's about Mr. Rogers. Tom Hanks plays Mr. Fred Rogers in that movie. And that, I think that's an epitome of what you're describing from the way they took that film and the lessons that we all can learn from it. So I'd advise people to check that one out as well as, and maybe
filmed in Pittsburgh.
Say that again?
That was filmed in Pittsburgh, and many of the people I work with worked on that. And unfortunately, I was working on the doc while that was filming there, or I would have been able to work on it.
Fortunately, you were doing something also important. Yeah, I think from that, people can really look at their lives in a different way. I know that I did, and as I move forward, I think there's something I can learn from that. But as you describe what you're describing in all forms of media, I think that happens. And it's kind of scary how some people, many people, big influencers control a lot of narratives that surround us. And because we don't know any better, or because there's just so much of it happening, we just follow along. And that's dangerous, which really makes it important to just kind of let things play out in a different way, take in different perspectives, do whatever you can to not allow someone else to push you in a direction that you don't even feel that they're pushing you, but they are pushing you because they decided they know what's best and they want something to happen a certain way. So that's a great realization, a great being wrong here from you, Drew.
Thanks. Yeah.
Anything else as we wind down this conversation? Have I pushed this conversation in ways that I shouldn't have? Or anything else that you think that you want to share should be shared before we wrap up this talk here today?
No, I mean, I think we covered it really well, and I do appreciate, your openness to sort of go with the flow and hear it out and have us on, to talk about this story. And just as I did, with listening to somebody that said, "Oh, I have a story for you," and actually just getting out of my own way and not being selfish and being like, "I don't have time to hear you," and that's something that, you did in the car, in the Uber. And I think that's something we can all do more of. I know, like, I sometimes, especially that day, I remember I was like, you know what, I'm just not in a talkative mood. I'm cold. And also I don't always want to like push my film on people, because it's like, oh, what do you do? Oh, I do this. And then it becomes, I feel like sometimes it feels almost too rehearsed or like, but you seem genuine about it and you wanted to learn more about it. And you asked more questions, and I never know how someone's going to gauge. So I always just sort of start with the smallest bit, and it's sort of like, okay, here's the small piece. Oh, you like that? Well, here's a bigger piece of the story. Okay, so here's what it's really about, and it's like, and we got there before I had to go get my haircut, and it worked. It was perfect. And so I really appreciate, you genuinely asking questions and wanting to know the answers. And I think we can all learn a lot if we genuinely listen and don't just sort of like superficially go, okay, well, just to get through the Uber ride,
It's precisely, I've experienced thousands of Uber rides or Lyft rides as a driver, and not too often does a conversation lead to what this did with you. But for me, and often the other person, there's genuine curiosity. That's what drives me. That's why pretty much every question I ask is because I am curious, and I'm just hoping that somewhere there's dozens or hundreds or thousands or someday hundreds of thousands of people that are curious about the same things that I'm curious about and will like to listen to me asking questions of someone, because I don't know almost anything in the grand scheme of what there is to know. And I want to know more. So I'm going to ask questions, and hopefully people are willing to give me their best answer, and then it'll just flow from there, and it'll go where it goes. I don't really enter these things with a big narrative because I don't know any. I feel like I don't know anything. I know something, and I'm being humble in that way, but I don't know that much, and I want to know more. And I'm just hoping other people want to know more too, and that they're hearing you talk and they want to know more about what you're doing, because like for me, it's something very different than my life that I experienced, both what your film is about and the life that you're living, to put this film out to as many people that'll see it. like that last 9 years of your life doing what you've done, that's kind of crazy to me. But maybe 7 years from now, 9 years into my podcast, I'll look back and think, oh yeah, I did pretty much the same thing and I never saw it coming.
Yeah, I kind of created a theory for myself, which I probably should have said in my the vision or whatever. But I was studying poetry at this university in Colorado called Naropa University, and there's the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics, and we talked a lot about how your life is your art, and your art is a reflection of your life, and how you're exposing yourself to the things around you comes out. And it's a simple 3-word thing. Art, story, and life, and you can interchange the order, but, your art is your story is your art, your life is your story and your art, and, whatever. But yeah. And, so yeah, thank you, for doing that yourself and for having me on here and having this conversation and, acknowledging it, because it's important. Sometimes you feel like you're in a bubble, and, and it's nice to just talk with other people about it, and hopefully the audience heard something they like, and go from there.
Thank you, Drew. Well, I'll let you go now and let the audience get back to whatever they're going to do with their day, night, or life. And I appreciate your time. Blood Memory, A Story of Removal and Return. That's the film. All the links are as part of the show notes, and I look forward to seeing the big premiere on public television, and I'll help promote that when the time comes. Thanks again, Drew.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to People I Know Show. Find the links in the show notes to follow People I Know Show on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, as well as links to several items mentioned in today's conversation. If you like what I'm doing, leave a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or the People I Know Show Facebook page, and also share this episode. Spread the word. You can send your feedback directly to me, Kurt Karstensen, using the email address peopleiknowshow@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.